audience so far is Mark. Mark, why don't you say hi and introduce yourself?
I just telling you a little bit ago. I mean, I'm just I've been a fan of Rick's work for a while. It's how he got started and how I learned how to do almost everything that I'm doing. And I started getting a little braver as I was buying more and more of the toys for doing pressing and cleaning. And it's amazing. It's been amazing. So this is like next step here is to get your book and learn more about paper, because the modern paper is crazy. I have I have a friend who's got a small indie publishing company, and he's been selling through Diamond for a long time. And I went to try to work on some of those books, and they literally just melted. And so I realized pretty quickly that not all books are created equal. And so I stepped out of that process, and I stopped trying to press using heat anything new or newish, and until I learn more. So, but recently I got a stack here, and we'll play. And there's a lot of different ones in here. They're all current. They all came in damaged. So we said, take them home, see what you can do with them. So but there's 4 different types of paper in here. So I'm looking forward to asking those questions about the different kinds that are in here. So, but yeah, that's, I'm just a
expert artist,
conservator. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
all right, Shelby, we'll go clockwise from my view. Shelby, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep.
Yeah. So Shelby, Shelby's Comics. You can find me here on the YouTubes, but I kind of like you a lot of ways, Mark, is I've known Rick for probably about 4 or 5 years now. Mm-hmm. I started out in cleaning and pressing, and it wasn't for like resale or anything. Mine was, I would buy these books that I knew were freaking beautiful, and I would send them in the CGC, and it's like, I know this is a 9.2, and it'd come back like an 8.0 because it would say, small fine crease or something like that. And I'm looking through the slab trying to find the crease, and, so it was more of a thing of just like not trying to resell something, but, like I know this book is better than what it is, and you're dinging me for these minor defects. And so that's really where I kind of started. And but then, like you, I just kind of evolved, and Rick with his cleaning solution, got involved with him, talking to him. And then eventually, about a year or so ago, I found Dr. Paul and conservation. And so it's just been a natural evolution, right? It's never been an equity thing. It's never been a, I don't want to say, wasn't to get higher grades, but, hey, when I bought, when I buy Star Wars #1 as a 9.2 and I send to CGC and it comes back an 8.0, you damn well believe I want to press that damn thing, because I just paid a 9.2 price for it.
Well, I know that you took it to a different level. You and Paul both, like you took it to, I wonder how this works. I'm curious. And then it's like saying, I wonder how cars work. And then you build a Maserati, right? Is what happened.
Paul, I built with the 72 Mercury Comet.
Not a lot of people go to, right? Yeah. And so, Paul, how about that? That's a nice segue for Paul.
Sure. Yeah. Glad to be on the channel. Really appreciate you being on our channel 8 days ago now, last week, Sunday. Rick, was a great show, very well received. And it was about time. We've actually been trying to get you on for a while. And between your travel, and our goal was actually to have you on when we had a full complement, but we finally gave up on that because we just couldn't get everybody's schedules together. So I want to thank you again for being on. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Paul Kosnick, Liberty Hill Comics. I go by Dr. Paul on the YouTubes. My PhD is in biomedical engineering, but I studied chemical engineering in undergrad. And I think it's true probably of all of us. We don't really do a lot of halfway, right? If we're going to go, we go all in. And so when I first started cleaning and pressing and was availing myself to like the material that was out there, either YouTube or the books that have been written, the Facebook groups, immediately started seeing like some information that just didn't make sense if you had even like a basic understanding of science or thermodynamics. And I thought, well, who am I? I'm just walking in the door. And then decided actually, yeah, that's actually my role here. So I dove deep into so it turns out there's a huge literature on paper preservation, conservation. There are conservation scientists. You can get a degree in paper conservation, and they have peer-reviewed journals. And there's this whole giant body of literature on how to take care of paper. And it just seemed to me like no or very few people in comic books had any knowledge that this literature even existed, let alone practiced any of it. So I found my niche on the channel. I do a few different things on the channel, but one of the main ones was just bridging the gap between this huge body of knowledge that exists, it's in the public domain, this peer-reviewed literature, and comic book cleaners and pressers, aficionados and collectors who don't have any knowledge of it. And because I have a PhD and I can read this kind of literature and interpret it, I thought bridging that gap is a thing that I can do to contribute to this community. And so I had that as a goal, but it didn't become reality until I really met Shelby, and he and I started chatting about it, and being able to collaborate with somebody on this just made it something that is just so much better than it could have been had I written it or Shelby written it alone, right? You know how that works. It's just like, it's the furnace that tempers your blade, right? When you have somebody who's really good, really smart, can take criticism, can provide, feedback. And so Shelby and I just had a great collaboration putting together this book right here. So
let's do a shameless plug.
Yeah. So one, let me say is I've always said this, is there's a similarity between like when I found Rick's channel, and he was a scientist, and I'm a scientist, I have a PhD in human factor psychology. And so I've been involved in research for 30 something years. And, it's like, okay, this is the, someone that could speak my language and is into comic books, right? And then the same thing with Paul, right? As soon as I started seeing him and his methodology and such, like, okay. And I remember contacting Paul, and I was like, hey, you might not know this, but we're going to become friends. Mm-hmm. And I bugged him until he admitted he was my friend.
That's true. And then he sent me, I gave him an assignment to do for our Facebook group, which I thought was just a simple writing assignment. I thought it'd be like 4 pages. And he sent me 30 pages back. And then I said, we are writing a book. Yeah. And here it is.
So for some reason I'm reversed. I can fix that. I know.
No, you're fine for us. Actually, you're reversed for you, but you're fine for us.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I started out around 30, 40 pages. I just kept writing because I had so much knowledge in my head. I'd already put out about 30 or so videos. I'd watched all of Paul's videos, all of Larry's videos, all of Jerry's, all of Rick's, so I had this large body of knowledge. And several people had reached out and said, hey, we love your videos, but have you ever thought about writing this stuff down? And so I started writing. I didn't stop until we ended up with this a couple of months later. And so this really takes you through almost every facet of conservation. Now, to kind of Mark's response earlier, we do not cover modern books. We deal mainly in old books and old paper. That is what is in most danger of dying, for a better word. And that is where our love has been. And but not to say we don't know a little something about modern techniques and stuff. But yeah, old stuff.
I will give a quick review of modern paper, and you guys correct me or add to my knowledge where you think I'm wrong. Like several comics, I have seen the entire cover just pop right off and just leave bare paper underneath, and it's a thin film of the entire cover, not just one color, but all of it. In fact, I just got an Amazing Spider-Man. It's behind me somewhere, like 66 the other day. One of the interior pages, all of the ink that was supposed to be on like a third of the page was folded over the rest of it.
Yeah,
like
it just delaminates as a sheet.
Yeah, it just came off, and you just can stick it over there. Like it's just mechanically pressed into the paper. So it's very different. So what happens for me is if that is if it gets over about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, since I'm in America, it can wrinkle and come off of the base paper or split like a craggly split, or it can discolor, like just the reds will just bleach out. And that's a huge difference from, I'm going to say, up to 2000. I don't know when. They call this normalization. I don't know what normalization means, but that's the word for like physically pressing a sheet of the printed ink into the paper. Completely different scenario for cleaning and pressing, and it's a vapor barrier, right? For cleaning. Immaculate Clean does work at getting fingerprints off of that stuff, but it's not going to soak into the paper like it does with regular paper and help things to release. So it's I use it on like like lightly wet on a Kim wipe just to rub as a fingerprint remover, but it's not going to remove other stains the way it would. And also the pressing is gentler. I go about 40 pounds of pressure instead of 55 like I use on the big press, and it's about 135, 130 degrees, and instead of 900 seconds, I'm usually going for I usually go for about 1,500, 2,000 seconds. And then there's cold pressing is a must. I have to cold press. In fact, these books I'll only cold press because it's much better luck with cold pressing, but cold pressing takes a week.
Yeah.
Right?
Have you guys noticed too, another big difference that I've noticed is a long box of old books weighs about 30 pounds, and a long box of these new modern books weighs about 70 pounds. Like, you will break your back. A long box of I don't know why that stuff is so dense.
You can fit more of them. Fit more of them in a box.
But it is really dense. It is like I'm talking about, like, if you pack a long box, regardless of the number of books in it, the modern paper is really dense. Like, that's a heavy long box. I ripped the handles off my boxes with new books.
So, and the printing, I started out as a graphic designer, so I know quite a bit about printing itself. And like you were saying, the printing process is completely different than what we had with these older books, like the Silver Age. They were still using color plates. They were using Indian inks in most cases. Modern inks are soy based. If you didn't know that, most of them are soy based. So it's very different than like your petroleum based. The paper is, like for us to get glossy on these is you have pulp paper, then it's glossed, right? It's covered with something like a clay coating and gloss and things like that. The paper today is like, it's all one object, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's why maybe that's why they call it normalizing, right? It's just one surface. Really.
Yeah, and I'm not even positive it's all done as like laser printing, right? Like you can have offset printing, you can have screen printing, you can have like plate printing. I'm not even positive it's something beyond even laser printing that they do today.
Rick is double wristing. Go like this, Rick.
Yeah, dude.
Come on, man. So, Rick, I wore a Speedy just for you.
Oh, thanks, brother.
This is my only Speedy.
I will give you my short,
for my health, and this for my heart.
Yeah, that's a good one. I should start doing it, at least on camera. Yeah. I should double wrist
I was working on my 3D printer today, and I had taken this off. I was glad because I was in there like pulling on a really hot bolt, and I pulled it, and I slammed my wrist on the top, and thank God I took this thing off.
Right. Yeah. Better my wrist than the acrylic on my
Yeah,
Speedy.
yeah, exactly. That's my biggest fear, getting my hand chopped off where I put my watch,
So
This book here, this is the Fantastic Four #1. If you look at it, you can actually see like a lot of the places that there's ink like oversprayed, there's little errors, there's little bits of character in the printing that you can see if the blade was dull when it was chopped, different things. And then this is like a modern book, right? And they're all going to be exactly identical.
Exactly.
Isn't that the super rare late printing of that book?
I don't know.
Rick doesn't know. Yeah,
it is
the
a later
cover is the one you want. Yeah,
that's the purple one.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I mean,
I was sure
there you go, Ben Stewart. I know something.
Here's something real quick. This is the Daredevil #3 somebody gave me.
Oh,
it's a Bago Daredevil. He said, "What can you do with this?" He said,
"How did he even get like that? Like, did
he make some paper pulp?"
He had it on the floor near where his pets are in the house, and his cat got into the front of his box and scratched his earliest comics up into little pieces. Because he actually put a scratching post next to the comic book box.
Wow! So he trained them to do that.
Now. I'm sure he said a bad word out loud, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So my best thing with modern books, and I'll say modern as like the interior is glossy. No full humidification. Like I would use like our steam hand steamer and spot steam it, right? Like only the areas that need fixing, so to speak, only hitting those areas. I actually watched the video between you and Mark earlier today, and y'all are talking about even spot humidification using like wet cotton rounds or a Q-tip.
Yeah, I do that a lot.
That is the level of moisture you want to put into modern books, right? Which is like almost none.
I do even I'll go on the book and go.
And
where I want to do a cotton round. I'm not kidding. I don't put any more moisture than that in it, typically.
Right. For me, it is a wet Q-tip touched and released. That's what I do.
So
and then for heating, low heat, like Rick said, a backing board in the center, SRP paper between the cover and the first wrap. Usually SRP paper on the outside also. Now I wouldn't, normally say that when we're talking about doing like our full aqueous washes and humidification and things like that here. But for modern books, I would recommend it because you have such little moisture in there, and you don't want to lose what's moisture is already in that paper, because then it's going to become brittle. It's going to break. I mean, if you heard people talk about baking books, that's what they're talking about is modern books, and you will bake that sucker to where it's stiff as a board. And
it cracks when you
and it cracks.
You had a question?
Well, I every couple 2-3 weeks I'll go pick up my current issues that I get, and this is I don't get this particular title, but this is one of the books that my buddy gave me at his shop, and it's just a typical modern book. It's Rogue, and it's typical paper. It's got a little bit of a gloss to it, and it's like and I'm getting mostly, if not all, Marvel and some Image, and I get them home and there's a couple of ticks in the spine, and I'm like, that's the difference. And I'm very I'm very particular. So what I found, and this is watching you, Rick, is depending on the level of it, a drop. I don't even use a drop of water. I use a wet Q-tip and I just let it sit there for just a quick second, and then I put a piece of silicone paper inside, and then I will close it. And I will I'll put silicone paper over the top and use a tack iron, and that's it. I don't press it. I put it in the cold press for 2 days, comes out beautiful. But I don't even put it in the press. A few of them where there might be a dimple somewhere, I I will put it in the press, like you said, 120 for an hour. And then it goes right into the cold press. And again, for at least 2 days. And that seems to do the trick on these particular ones that are the plain Marvel books. I tried steaming these, and it causes not steaming. Let me rephrase that. I use the steamer, but at a distance, just to get it creates this weird,
more like a fogging machine.
All of a sudden,
it looks fogged up.
But at the same time,
that will come out in a heat press.
Because it doesn't bubble, but it changes the texture, and I'm like, oh crap! But in the heat press, it does seem to do better. But like you said, it maybe fixes that. But I need to test it with this again to see. But if you get too close to the heat, I think it interferes with the surface enough you can't get it back. I don't know.
We have a question for you. Ben asks, Mark, please explain your cold press process.
So this is Rick's cold press process. And all I'm doing is putting it between 2 sheets of acrylic with some weight. And I just leave it there for 2 days. And
you don't buffer the book at all when you do a cold press?
What do you mean?
Like centerfold, backing board, SRP above, below, between the covers, anything?
I'm not putting that much weight on it. It's just I actually took a Ziploc bag and I just filled it with sand, and then I wrapped it real good, because a couple of times I'd found grains of sand, and then all of a sudden I got a pit in the book. I start over. So you want to be very careful about that. I always make sure that the glass is really clean, but just acrylic sheets, and those are on Rick's website.
Yeah, I found that it's 2 pounds. It's actually 1 kilo is the weight that works best for me. More than that, it's like you actually are not encouraging the wrinkles to come out. There's something about that top tension that makes the wrinkles stay more if it gets too heavy. So there is an optimum, which surprised me. Actually.
Well, and interestingly enough, I'll stack 10 high, so I know the bottom one's getting a little more weight, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
I will stack them, and it doesn't seem to create any issues.
It isn't if you have, and here's the difference. If you have a coat, so if you have a wrinkle, I call them the big wavies that go like this, like that. Those ones, the spine ticks and other things, as long as you have a board in the middle or something, a normal force pressing up on it, the cold press helps take. I think in 10 years we'll be talking about cold pressing more than hot pressing. I think it's the great.
We may be, I think it is.
Well,
definitely an area for improvement.
Big wavies, I call it, where they're like this far apart. Actually, if there's too much weight, won't come out of the paper. And there's some physics going on there that I don't understand, but the little micro ones will come out. The normal force will push up, but there's enough tension. When you put force down on something, it's down and out always, right? It's not just down. And so it needs a little bit of what we call a normal force pushing up on it to flatten it out. But if there's too much down and out, it doesn't feel the normal force very much, and it won't wave it. So you probably have an experience.
Here's one other thing.
So here are these are great. I mean, Immaculate Comic pressing boards. They're in several different thicknesses. What I do is, if I cold press several books, is I'll use a thinner one, book on it. I'll do an example here. Book. Then another thin one, book, and then the thick one on top. Now Rick had done some experiments way back, and the reason why, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the weight of the thicker ones actually provide just about the right amount of pressure for long duration pressing. But what I do is I use these little clamps. And there you go.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Sandwich. So yeah, the thicker the 1/2-inch boards are exactly 2.2 pounds.
Yeah.
I'm even using some.
I have questions.
Yes.
I'm using even an 1/8 of an inch, and I'll, like I said, I'll stack 10 and put that little bit of weight on top, and it comes out great. But I will just real fast before we move to you.
No, actually, that question's for you, Mark. And so you just brought it up. So help me understand what a stack of 10 looks like. So you said there's no backer board or buffer in the comic. You're taking a comic book and you're setting it down, then you're putting another comic on top of it. And you're doing that 10 times, and then you're putting a piece of acrylic on top.
No, no,
Help me understand.
no.
Clean every book.
Just like I showed,
Every other one.
Just like
Right.
what Shelby did. Yeah.
Okay.
comic book.
So acrylic book,
Correct.
book, 10 high.
Exactly.
And the key, and interesting too, is that, and I didn't learn this, until later from Rick. I mean, I think I watched an old video, and I think he said 24 hours. And then I moved and I started realizing even that's not enough. I give it at least 48. And sometimes I'll just forget about it because I have enough stacks of them that I can, I can come back later. But that paper has memory and it wants to go back to the way it was.
It will want to revert.
Cellulose is a polymer. It's hard to believe. The reason there's a 24-hour and like a 3 to 5 day hour is lignin is not a polymer. It's an amorphic mess of stuff, right? And if you have a lot of lignin or hemicellulose in your paper, it branches everywhere and it terminates in little alcohols and aldehydes everywhere. Am I getting, this may be too technical. Sorry. Other stuff besides other things. But the stuff
We love technical.
long chains, right? That can have a memory to them, right? And they're like sitting on top of each other this way. The more lignin you have, the less memory you'll have, but also the faster you'll decay, right? That things oxidize a lot easier. And so it's 24 hours if your book has a ton of lignin. It's what we call pulp paper. It's longer if your paper is nicer and has more of a memory to it. That's my take on it.
Here's one other thing that I discovered with cold pressing is that if you need to make sure, like I've got this, this old school, like, I don't know if it's what kind of, if it's like a fur or something that's like a duster. Make sure that acrylic is clean, because if there's even a speck of anything on there, you've all of a sudden put a pit in the book and you're starting over again. And you might have to go back and you have to roll that out, and it's a pain. So make sure they're really.
Mine are pretty dusty right now, but I keep some bleach wipes near me and, wipe it down, then come back with it and stuff and clean it.
I went to the hobby shop and bought a bolt of first I bought a bolt of felt, and then I bought a bolt of I don't know what it is. It's cheap stuff. And I just cut some cardboard sheets and I glued them on there. I glued the felt on both sides and I stacked them up, and I just have all my sheets in between felt boards. So they're always clean. They're always, and that way there's no scratches on any of them. And I just set them out and set them up. And I've got all these different sizes now because I bought a few different sizes from Rick, and I've figured out, just played around with different ones myself. But it's those are little things that they get by you, and you might as well learn from my successful failures that keep those boards clean for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've never really talked about my cold pressing. I didn't realize there was this much variability in the way people cold press. So if I cold press, I buffer my book exactly like as if I'm going to do a heat press. So I have backing board in the centerfold, usually a 65-pound cardstock between the cover and the first page, something like that. And what I do is I'll set one down. So I'll take like 2 magazine backer boards and just put them on my countertop, which is granite. Just because the granite itself is not perfectly smooth, even if it's perfectly flat, right? So I put 2 backer boards down, and then I buffer that book, and then I set that book down. Then what I'll do is I'll take 2 more backer boards and set them down, and I'll take the next book, and I will alternate the spine. So it'll go this way.
I do that.
Then I'll put 2 backer boards, and I'll do one with the spine the other way, 2 backer boards, one with the spine the other way. And then I usually put like my granite slab on top, and I just leave them there. A lot of times what I'll do is if I'm prepping something to go to CGC, I take my time. So I'll heat press a book, right? And then I want to just basically, I don't want it to revert. So I'll just leave it in cold press. So it'll be my first book in this stack, and I'll have that granite slab on it. Then the next day, or maybe 5 days later, I'll work on my next book for the submission, and I'll heat press that. When it's done, I take the granite slab off. I put a layer of backer boards. I put the next book, another layer of backer boards, put the granite on top. So the first book that I press stays in cold press maybe like a month while I prep the other 20 books. And then when the last one goes in, I'll wait, at least 3, 4, 5 days. And then I'll take the whole stack out and put them all in bag-in boards and do my submission to CGC or whatever I'm going to do. So that's
Yeah.
how I manage it.
About the books flexing by stacking them, even though you've got boards in between, because that's why I use the acrylic in between each book, is that way it can't flex or move, and I've got a nice flat smooth surface. I just wondered if you have found that to be an issue.
I think between the centerfold backing board and the backer boards between, I have never seen anything of the sort.
We also though.
So I think what happens
era,
is
what era book though? Like,
well, I do moderns that way too. I mean,
Okay.
we only talk on our channel. We really only talk about Bronze Age and older, but I have modern books and I sub them, and I have some modern keys, and those are the ones I try to chase 9/8 on. So yeah, so this is all eras. But what happens is, so you have your book, and normally the book is folded and it's got a staples over, let's say over here, right? And if you just try to put a weight on that, this is never going to fold perfectly. So it's kind of slanted, right? But when you put a backer board in the middle, the backer board is thicker than the difference in the spine ability to crunch. So the backer board now is now the thing that determines the full stack height.
Interesting.
So when you're pressing them that way, all the weight is on the backer board and the papers here and not here so much. So it's not going to do much for spine ticks. But I took those out usually in the heat press. The cold press for me is mostly about just making sure reversion doesn't occur.
Right. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about plastic for just a second, because it's important to not just, I used encyclopedias when I was a kid, right?
Mhm.
A lot of things don't.
I use phone books.
Yeah. So I will say that it seems like cold pressing is like the dumbest possible thing. So why would you talk about it, right? You just put something heavy on something flat and it works. But there's a lot of things to it. Like my chamfer pressing boards are actually thinner on the end near the staple, so it evens the height out.
Magic.
There's all these little things to it, right?
Border magic.
It's so interesting. So, but the acrylic that I use is not extruded. It's cast closed cell acrylic with no plasticizers in it. You may recall, if you watch a lot of channels like Sticky Goose and other people complaining about these comic capsules that have this outgassing of plasticizers. I don't know if anybody here heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it's a comic case. I have some around here somewhere.
It's actually why we have the new car smell.
Yeah, exactly. They're right here. They look like this. They sent me a bunch of them, but I didn't use them. And so what this looks like is you have a holder and you put a comic book in here, and there's either a dark or a clear background that's polypropylene, right? And this is polycarbonate on the front, not lucite. But the back is polypro because it's cheaper and it can be injection molded and it's easy to bend into place. What's happening is some people are getting, when they get warm or sitting on your wall for a while, they're getting a case where they have this white, like I'm going to call it smoke or something, like a white stain of like
Milky, milky kind of look.
It's on their wall and they're completely freaking out. Well, you could take it off, but I'm saying, like, just so you know, I think actually this one actually has a little bit of it. I come to think of it. So people are really upset. It wipes off with just even acetone. Now, if you want to leach plastic before you use it, I do, and you can use it. I mean, I soak it in sodium hydroxide, all kinds of crazy stuff. But you can just wipe it with ammonia, some kind of strong base. It opens up those cells, draws the plasticizers out. You'll be fine. It's not a big deal. But somebody did ask me to mention something about it while I was on here, because it's been sort of a big, like a quote, another one of these manufacturer scandals, like the CGC one last year, which I also played a big role in that one. But I didn't make a lot of friends. But it's interesting. You can just wipe those with ammonia before you use them, and they'll be fine, honestly. So anyway, there's that.
Plastic is not inert unless it's Mylar D or Melanex.
Yeah, well, but you can have closed cell ones, so they don't have as many plasticizers coming.
Sure.
Out. And there's ones that have open cell, and Polypro is a mess. It's a mess of stuff. It has stuff way deep in their big pore. If you let those expand in a base, they broaden and the stuff can come out.
Yep.
I think they're good.
So back to paper. This is the standard. This is a cardstock, and it's got a gloss, a pretty heavy gloss. And I don't know if you can see like the corners taken.
That looks like chromium. That looks like
It does. It does. It's not chromium, but it looks like that. It's just.
Would we call that a foil cover?
Like it's like Venom #1 is what that is.
I mean, even yeah. I
So
mean,
there's only one. I've never had any.
it's not raised either, but it's got a pretty bad. You know, you can see the corner right there, and I'm gonna play around with it, but I think it's gonna be water, it's gonna be heat, and it's gonna be a tack iron, and it's gonna be a chamfer board, and we'll see what happens.
So here's my tip on that. I've done so many Venom #1s that red, and there's a black one, and they are really hard. If you get them hot at all, that color, that gloss will just be gone. You'll have
That's what I'm about to find out. All of that.
You can only work on those from the inside of the cover. So you can only open the inside, get the inside wet, and use your tacking iron on the inside of these covers only.
Okay, so
you can remove the cover. These are actually some of the easiest ones to remove.
because the inside is not a gloss at all. It's just, and it looks like the normal cardstock on the inside. So
that's where you want to attack it from. A little bit of water, tacking iron with SRP, and you can work it out from the inside. Don't do anything the outside of that book, or you'll be able to tell within like 10 seconds that you
sent me 3 of these. So it's my buddy Sang Trong, and he owns Collectibles Marketplace in Denver. It's a brand new store. And it's phenomenal. I mean, he decked this thing out like you can't believe, and he's got cases and cases and cases in there for people to rent too. So I'm gonna start putting things inside.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But he sent me enough of them I can play and do. You know, I've got even more.
Oh, wow.
So here's Image, which this is a very flat paper.
Mm.
And this one's got, you know, you can't see very well, but the corner there, I don't know if you can even see it in the light. There's a few wrinkles there.
I'm trying to turn my head and see it better.
That's going to behave, I think, more like old school paper.
I think so too, and I think it's going to be this one. I think I can probably warm
a little more forgiving. I think, yeah, that's been my experience.
To you guys, and I'll kind of try to keep track of, you know, what I've done before and afters and see, but. And then so all of these images are the same type of that flat, that matte, so to speak. Mm-hmm. This is another Image Gunslinger. Again, it's a cardstock, but it's not glossy. But I mean, it's going to be interesting to see if I don't know if you can see the wrinkles on that one either. My camera, we've got a good camera, but it's really washed out today. Sorry about that. Anyway, these are all different. This is cardstock, not glossy. I mean, and I feel like when I look at this versus the Rogue, that they feel the same as far as thickness goes, but you can just see that the texture on the surface is a little different.
Oh yeah,
so
a little different.
They're all going to be interesting to try out. I think that was 3 or 4 different ones. I've got a stack to play with. I just haven't done it yet, but I wanted to show you them.
That looks like fun. Yeah, let us know what you learn.
I will. I'll try to you know use some appropriate techniques with befores and afters instead of just doing it and then trying to go back and fill in the blanks. But yeah, because usually I don't do that.
If you wreck any Rogue Savage Lands, you can send them my way. Okay. I'm sure they'll still make good reading.
They're beautiful books. Sorry about coughing. But about a year and a half ago, somebody, maybe they're watching this show right now, sent me a box of old FFs and Daredevils and things from like the early 70s, and they weren't low value. So he sent me a box of work on it. He sent them to me, and all of them were double covers. I'm like, you sent me somebody's double cover collection.
What?
He didn't even know it. He bought these books in some estate sale or something, and they were selling, but they never went through them all. And I still have most of them. I'm looking, I'm like, oh my God, every one of these books.
Wow.
It must have been.
All right, we gotta talk about that off camera.
Yeah.
Maybe we can make a deal.
Yeah. You need to be helping some brothers out.
I was shocked. I was like, what? So, but he was like marking them off. He had written on the outer cover because they weren't worth much, like putting a Sharpie pen and writing a price discount on them and stuff, and they weren't moving. But nobody knew that the reason someone collected them was they were double covers.
Yeah.
I'd like to, because we're running a little bit short on time here. I would like to see if one of Shelby, if you or Paul could help us through your presentation. I know you went to some effort to put this through. If you could walk us through it a little bit, if I present, is that okay?
Yeah. I'll just kind of start us off, and Paul, I'll pass off to Paul. But go ahead to the next slide. One of the things we do talk about in the book is when you're talking about conservation, and we'll say cleaning and pressing for the moment. And it's just like we've been talking about. First, you got to understand the era. You got to understand the era you're dealing with, the materials, the printing techniques. You know, a golden age book is going to be a lot different than a modern age book, like Mark's been showing. Understanding the paper's composition. We've been talking about that all evening too, right? You know, is this cardstock? Is this a full cover? Is this high lignin? And then the decisions, right? And we've been talking about that too, right? What is our decisions in working this defect out? You know, if it's that full cover, the decision's going to be probably come from the inside. Maybe even take the cover off completely, like Rick suggested, because those can come off fairly easy, and work it from a different way in which you would work something else. You don't want to do the wrong technique. And then when we're talking about old books, so again, this was geared towards old books, is stabilization. I kind of give a little bit of breakdown of what like Golden Age looks like, and the era, you know, thicker, rougher, Bronze Age, and such. So it may not, none of this may be actually, you know, geared towards what we've been talking about tonight, but it's good information, and the same techniques or processes is still used, whether we're talking about old or new, right? It's the same techniques and same process. Did you have anything you want to add there on that one?
I'm responding to some folks in the chat. So
yeah, I got some.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. And this is just a little bit of history. So when we're talking about gold, silver, bronze, modern, copper, modern, you know, I say anything except for that where the interior gloss is. You know, you're dealing with pulp paper, you're dealing with high lignin, you're dealing with acidity, you're dealing with yellowing, brittleness, low cost materials, disposable entertainment. Now, I'm not positive what the lifespan is on modern books with the, you know, glossy interiors and things like that. I'm not sure if there's a consideration in terms of printing practices of these now being a collectible versus a disposable entertainment like they were seeing back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even probably 80s. If there's a consideration with printing practices that these will be more sustainable over time versus pulp paper. And I have no idea, none whatsoever.
Yeah. Interestingly, you know, the switch to higher quality papers, which are basically whiter, brighter papers that occurred in the 80s, where
with the Baxter paper.
Yeah, Baxter and Mando were the two that the industry went to, and you know, like New Teen Titans was relaunched on Baxter paper, direct only market, and that was kind of the one that I really remember. But before that,
you know, one, I think the interior was.
I think that's correct. Yeah. So there, you know, that was around that time where they started experimenting. Turns out, actually, though, that even though that paper is whiter and brighter, it was not by the manufacturers deemed to have a longer shelf life than the paper that had been used at the time or prior to that time. So yeah, it's brighter.
And in some cases it could be shorter, right? Because the brightness is usually due to bleaching, and we know
bleaching or other calcium carbonate, clays, and other things that are added to increase the brightness. So it's unknown how those papers will age. Our book is mostly about Golden Age or Platinum Age through Bronze Age, because that's where most of the interest is in conservation. I do consider cleaning and pressing sort of the fundamentals of conservation. But I think most people think of that as its own category, cleaning and pressing. And then conservation is the stuff that goes a step beyond that, I think, in a lot of people's parlance. So at any rate, our book really goes into perhaps gory detail about the paper that was used through those periods. A couple of interesting things that maybe not everybody knows. We talk about sizing on paper. Newsprint is not sized, or it's what's called slack sized, meaning it just has a very small amount of incidental sizing. Why does that matter? What does it have to do with our conservation efforts? What it means is that I think it's obvious to everybody, the interior pages and the covers are different, but they're really, really different. They are manufactured in a different way. They have different compositions. They're finished in different ways. And so when we treat interior pages versus covers, it's actually requires very different techniques because they're chemically quite a bit different. They have different additives. That one of the biggest ones is in the Silver Age, they started adding a lot of clay as a filler to brighten the covers. And so covers of DC and Marvel both in the 60s started being brighter and much denser. And it's because of the use of this kaolin clay that's in there. Well, the clay is actually water soluble to a certain degree. And this is why
you see so much ink left with Silver Age books.
This is why when I know Rick says a lot of times, he can treat with Immaculate 100 Silver Age comic books and expect to get the same result over and over and over again, and then just have one that behaves completely differently, and not sure why, but it can be just completely wrecked, right? Yeah. And it's basically comes down to this major additive that was present in older papers, but really became a major constituent known as kaolin in the 60s. And that kaolin can just delaminate and take the ink with it from the rest of the paper matrix. It's supposed to be basically in the paper matrix, but they started using a lot of it. And sometimes it's basically on the paper, and that's when it lifts. So those are differences in the paper manufacturing. Can also be differences in what that paper's experienced, since the day it was printed up till now. So one of the things we found is things that have previous water damage don't tolerate new water very well at all, right? Yeah. Whereas things that have never had water damage or not been in high humidities can tolerate new water quite well. So just a lot of things to think about. We touched on, again, what we did was we drew from the scientific peer-reviewed literature on paper conservation, and we pulled out what was pertinent from that to comic book conservators, and we summarized it in the book with some, hands-on examples and some what we thought were good uses of the knowledge from ourselves and actually a lot of other people in the community. One of the things we decided to do, we could have used all examples from our own channels or our own labs or conservator studios, but we didn't want to. Like, we have a couple of examples each for fun, but most of the examples in the book actually come from the community, from you guys, from other cleaners and pressers and conservators. We have projects from Rick, and we have projects from Larry and lots of folks, Jerry the Jitterbug, other folks that you may or may not know.
You're very generous with the credit or blame, however you want to.
No, the credit goes to the men and women in the arena, and we wanted them credited in the book.
Yeah, you did it. You guys did a great job, and I want to say too, just for everybody watching, you guys, I've talked to you guys like offline, and you are just exactly who you are. You're decent, wholesome, good, honest, straightforward people as humans, and it comes across in your writing. And I know some people online who are very different in their than they are as their online personas, and you'd be shocked to know where this human came from that you see on the screen. You guys are exactly how you present. I would say.
Yeah, appreciate it.
We're very humble. So this just kind of goes through just a breakdown of the 3 ages we focused on in the book, which was gold and silver and bronze. High lignin content, mechanical. Oh, and maybe not a lot of people do this, but covers and interiors were usually printed at 2 different factories and then put together. That's why you have things like the marble chipping, because the cover actually is longer or wider than the interior pages, right? And that's because it was made at two different places and then all stapled together at usually at the place where the interiors were created. So you'll see a lot of variability in that, unlike new books like Rick showed at the beginning of the.
And they were sometimes trimmed
show.
with sharp blades, and sometimes trimmed with dull blades, and sometimes at a straight angle.
Yeah.
You see things all torn apart. Yeah, you could tell like they haven't sharpened that blade in a while.
Yeah.
And you find all weird stuff in Golden Age books, man. Like someone was probably eating their peanut butter and jelly sandwich and it fell in, and you know, who knows what's in that pulp as it's going through. Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely not the sanitary conditions that we think of factories nowadays.
Quality control was not the same. And,
that's what I was trying to think.
It's getting more like as the eras go on, the paper gets more uniform, but it also gets cheaper generally until that switch in the 80s when they start going to higher quality. One other thing that we found out during the research for the book, I didn't realize this. I was somewhat surprised. Maybe we can even just do a little poll here. Do people think cover stock, and I'll just broadly say for gold, silver, and Bronze Age books, do you think that the cover stock is thicker than the interior pages? Or do you think the interior pages are thicker than the cover stock?
Sounds like a trap.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah. I have a micrometer, and I have measured, and I have been shocked sometimes at so I've seen cases where the interior pages are much, much thinner than the cover. And I've seen some cases where they were actually exactly the same thickness as the cover. And I was shocked by that. In fact, it was a Richie Rich book that I found that the cover was super thick compared to another one. I had one called it was a Western book that I had where the cover was actually Rawhide Kid, I think it was called. The cover was actually thinner than the interior pages, but it felt a lot stiffer. And I was super confused enough to want to throw my micrometer out.
I don't know if anybody else wants to play, but the covers that we measured from the gold, silver, and Bronze Age were universally thinner than the interior stock. And of course, they feel tougher, right? And they are tougher. They're much, much denser.
Yeah.
So there's more material there.
Density is not positively related to positively correlated with thickness.
So there's more material.
It could be inversely correlated because you're pressing, everything's pressed tighter.
So what happens with the covers is that cover stock, that paper goes through calendaring and goes through the sizing process. It's coated, and then during calendaring, it's really, really made much denser. And that's why it's so glossy, actually, because it is packed really tightly. And so if you measure the mass of it, it'll be greater than one of the interior pages. But if you look at the thickness, it's actually thinner. And I think this goes back to like humans' ability to perceive things. You've probably done that test where there's two things that both weigh exactly 10 grams, and one's really dense and the other one is, not dense. And if you go like this in your hands, the one that's dense, you would swear it's heavier, even though it's the exact same mass, right? It's just our ability to perceive things is limited in that regard. And so because we can sense that cover is denser and stiffer, it feels thicker to us. And in fact, it's thinner. And in all of the cases where we measured it, it was the same or thinner. And mostly thinner.
I didn't actually know this, but I've experienced it, and I've never talked about it because I thought people would burn me alive as an effigy because it was.
Come at me, man. Come at me.
It was heresy. I was like, this can't be true. So I just sort of scratched my head and just didn't think about it.
It's true. I couldn't find Well, Shelby, we did a little section in the book where we talked about this, and we actually went out. We couldn't find data anywhere, so we just collected our own.
Yeah.
And I had my micrometers out, and I was measuring page after page of Golden Age from different publishers, different eras. Like I said, I could not find the thickest covers I could find were the same thickness as an interior page. All of the rest were thinner.
Yeah.
And even that was like 1 out of 10.
Yeah.
But
so
anyway, just a little interesting
like
aside, or I think it's interesting.
Start creating our own database of that, since there is not very much out there. So someone just sold something on eBay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Cha-ching.
So the next slide, where are we at? So why does paper deteriorate? We've kind of talked about that, but what's really interesting, and I didn't really know this, this is something I learned writing the book, is pulp paper is auto-destructive. Like at the point in which it is manufactured, it is already starting to break apart because of the lignins and the and Paul's gonna correct me on the way I say this.
I will.
The lignins and expel.
So the biggest
lignins. Go ahead.
The biggest issue, and Rick, I'm not even sure if you know this, because this is a recent shift in the literature and in paper conservation and study. It was always thought that high lignin content paper was unstable, and you get the tanning, you get the brittleness, and the auto destruction, right? Yeah. And it was blamed on the lignin for decades in the literature.
That's my understanding.
And yeah, turns out more recently, the people that are studying this have shown that it's not lignin itself.
Right.
If you have a buffered page, so if you have a pH of 8.5, lignin is actually quite stable. It's lignin in high acid situations.
Oh.
So most of these newsprint pulps, they're just mechanical ground. They literally take a tree and they grind it up in the presence of acid at high pressure and temperature. And that's the pulp. And they do nothing to deacidify it or neutralize the acids used during the manufacture. So the paper goes to press very acidic. It's lignin plus the acidic environment. If you neutralize the paper that contains lignin, it's actually quite stable. Lignin itself is not a dirty word. It's just in the presence of this acidic environment, which is how it's always been made. It does break down, and it breaks down leading to byproducts that then spiral the breakdown because they accelerate the breakdown from there, right? And oxidative breakdown is always happening. That happens on cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. But the hydrolysis that happens to the cellulose, again, lignin was always blamed for accelerating the hydrolysis of the cellulose. Turns out it's not lignin per se, it's lignin in an acidic environment.
I see. Yeah. Lignin's an easier target. I understand now because it branches so much. There's so many secondary and tertiary carbons that those are electron withdrawing groups. And so they attract the proton from the acid more so they can.
Exactly. And then it starts a cycle, right? It starts a cycle of destructiveness. So really quick.
So I'm trying to make sure lignin doesn't, get a bad rap for everything and blame it on the acidic environment.
You're talking about two different things. Superman 1 was pulp paper, and Egyptian papyrus was more than likely cotton. Or hemp.
Papyrus itself is not actually even paper. So paper, the definition of paper is you reduce the fibrous material in a slurry called a furnish, and then you actually form the paper, and there's hydrogen bonding and certain things that happen. Papyrus is actually just literally reeds that were pounded in the presence of water, and they're layered and they're layered 90 degrees to one another like this, and then just pounded. It's not technically paper, and it does have some lignin in it, but the reason papyrus lasts so long is because it was in these incredibly dry environments. So without water, no hydrolysis can happen. The main breakdown of cellulose is through hydrolytic decomposition. If you have no water, you can't have hydrolysis, and so therefore it's
can't have pH without water either.
That's also true. So it's stable for incredibly long times, but that's the process there. There is lignin in papyrus.
You have one of those pens with the indicator in it, or what do you do?
I think this is another area where we're probably going to make a lot of advances. Like, I believe you're right in predicting cold press will be something that really gets explored a lot over the next decade in comics. I think pH is another thing that's going to get explored a lot. So to Toasty Toast question, the biggest thing is, how is it stored? By far, the biggest issue here is, how is it stored? How much oxygen, how much humidity, what temperature, and that's going to determine how long your Superman 1 lasts. If you can completely deacidify it, then you're gonna greatly extend the shelf life of that book. If failing that, even just getting some of that interleaving paper that can buffer the pH of the pages on either side and absorb some of the acidity out of the paper will greatly extend the shelf life of your Superman 1. But the main thing to know is, that once it starts a downward spiral, there's only so much you can do to kind of correct it. And if you don't take any intervention, it's going to accelerate. And basically, in the first half of its shelf life, it only gets 10% degradation. In the second half of its shelf life, it gets 90% degradation because it accelerates toward the end. So do everything you can to keep it relatively dry, relatively cool. And if you can do anything at all to correct the pH, do so. Interleaving paper is great if you don't want to do any more hardcore intervention than that. That will actually go a long way. And here's one more comment. I find this fascinating, just to comment on this question of why papyrus lasts so long, why Superman 1's, crumbling to dust. If you look at the history of paper in the Eastern and then the Western tradition, and, you've got about 1,000 years of history there, and the wood pulp, grinding up trees to make paper, was only invented post the Civil War. So it's like, comes on around really, and it gets ramped up in the 1880s. If you look at books made around 1900 and you compare them to books that were printed at 1600, the books that were printed in 1600 are in better shape today.
I've actually noticed this when you stay like in an old castle or something.
Absolutely.
They'll have books in the room, and they're like books older than my whole country, and they look pretty good. You can read them, but a book like a Charles Dickens from the late 19th century is falling apart. And
Garbage.
I've actually wondered the same thing.
It's brown, it's chipping. Yeah. The reason why is because this wood pulp that was used, it was much cheaper. So what was great about it? It made paper cheap. It meant books were cheap. It democratized book owning and book readership, because that used to be something only rich people could have. So that's great. However, those books were made out of paper that has a shelf life of 50, 100 years max. So that's why you see these books from 1880 to 1920, 30, that era, are just completely disintegrating right now, even despite the fact that books from 1600, 1500, even 1400s are holding up better. And it's because of how they were manufactured. And it's not just that they were grinding up the trees. Again, what they figured out was the only way to grind up a tree successfully and turn it into paper was to do it in sulfuric acid at high temperature and pressure. And so it's that acidic environment, the combination between the acidic, the acids that were never neutralized, and the lignin that gives it that very short shelf life. And unfortunately, comic books right up to the 80s were made from that kind of paper. So if we don't do something about it, all of those comic books are going to look like your Charles Dickens books in another 50 years or so.
Never the expectation that Superman #1 was ever going to be collectible.
Oh yeah,
printed on the cheapest,
completely,
throwaway paper it could be.
Completely disposable entertainment. Yeah, absolutely.
Now I'll make a comment about Superman #1, but first let me comment about this. Is we've been saying, I remember we used to say this back in the 80s, right? Is how best to protect your books. Put it into a cool, dark area. Don't hang them on the wall, cool, dark area, right? And that means low humidity, no light, no pollutions, in a box, sealed up, in a closet, and that is the best way to protect your books. Superman #1, I'll give you a little thing about it. Superman Action had already been coming out. They knew it was very popular. When they launched Superman #1, the cover was actually a thicker stock because on the back, Superman #1 is actually a cutout for them to say, cut this out and hang on your wall. And so it's actually a slightly thicker stock of the cover for Superman 1, so kids could cut off the back cover and hang it on their wall. So that actually helped protect the interiors a little bit more, I think, in my opinion. So that is a little trivia about Superman #1. We're talking about historical papers. A lot of those, when we talk about 1800s, we are talking about cotton, rag, hemp type papers, which do survive longer. My ex-wife is actually an archivist, and what they do is there's these acid-free binders that they'll put historical documents in. So they'll lay it in, and it folds over each side, and then they put Mylar around it, and then it's stored however it's stored. I think where you're thinking of the wooden boxes would be things like there are certain woods that are
insecticides.
Yeah. That
prevent pests. Yeah,
exactly. Cedar is one of those, right? A cedar chest.
The Mile High collection. A lot of the Mile High collection was stored in cedar chests.
Yep. Or a cedar closet that they had in the basement.
Yeah.
What about acid hydrolysis and oxidation? And I guess we don't have to talk about peroxide.
We've kind of already talked about.
Yeah, we kind of have. One thing I'll say is that for detecting pH, I have a couple methods on paper. I have different indicators that I just take one of those little Hamilton micro syringes, and I'll just like make a little line and see if it turns color. But that's adding water to the paper, which could change the pH slightly in that area. So it's never perfect detection, but I also have an infrared spectroscopy, and I look for acetic acid. That's the acid I look for as a breakdown product, because you can get the acetate ion. If you can see it, then that's a clue. I can't measure the pH. That I just know that it's less than 7, right? And so
have you looked at? Have you looked at? I mean, there's so many byproducts of hydrolysis, right? Like formic acid's got to be there too in some
lactic acid
in some amount. Lactic acid's got to be there in some amount. Yeah,
but they look like everything else to me in the fingerprint region. I can't see them just by themselves, but I can see in a molecular spectrum. I can see the acetate group by itself if it's there.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's what
I have some ideas for those that are interested in pH and comic books and comic book conservation. Check out Professor Peter Alachi's. Hey, Mike. Glad to see you here. Check out Professor Peter Alachi's channel, Experiments in Conservation. He's really done a deep dive in measuring pH on comic book paper to the extent that you can do it non-destructively, and how much it takes to neutralize the acid, as Rick likes to say. The reason why we use the deacidification term, Rick, is actually that's what's more or less universally used in the literature for paper conservation. They pretty much just refer to it as deacidification, though I agree with you. It really is neutralization is a equally correct term. And these breakdown products do contribute to the old comic smell, And sometimes it's worse than other times, though, right? Like sometimes the old comic smell is really acrid. And I do think that's, you can use your senses. You can kind of smell acid. Like you can smell that acidity in the paper as well. So,
And we actually have a story in our book talking about using your 5 senses with your comic books. So be sure and buy the book and read
and
that.
your spider sense.
So Ben asked, can you use a gas to change paper pH? And I think what you mean instead of gas is maybe a mist.
Evaporation, yeah.
Yeah, and yes, you can. You can actually, do I want to say atomize or do I want to say mist or humidify calcium hydroxide, and it will leach into your paper and reduce the acidity. But it's not going to do anything with removing tannins and things like that, which is usually what you're wanting to try and do in those cases.
I've used ammonia and also sodium metasilicate that way with fog chamber, like and it's helped.
Why do you use calcium hydroxide, right?
Say it again.
Is there a reason for being fancy?
Because I have a lot of expensive equipment that I like to use. And so instead of wasting my money,
I love the idea of using a sonicator. I have not. This is another area where I actually recently got disabused of like my understanding of how these things worked, and it turns out I need to do some more homework on this. But it's a fascinating area of opportunity for us because it's more like a fog machine than a mister in that it's not actually using heat to like make steam. It's not a steamer. It's actually like fog, right? So it's
megasonics to
it's using sonic waves to generate tiny micro bubbles that float off the surface of the solution like fog. And so that fog, because you haven't boiled the water, like if you boil the water, it enters into gas phase without bringing the ions with it. So you now have basically distilled water, right? We've already talked about this, not good for comic books. If you sonicate microbubbles off the surface, they carry the ions with them. So now if that fog lands on your paper, it actually brings the deacidifying ions with it, the neutralizing ions, I should say, and then it can actually leave that alkaline reserve in the paper. Now, one thing it doesn't do for you that a full aqueous bath does, the full aqueous bath removes all the soluble byproducts of the oxidation and hydrolysis. So the formic acid that's sitting there actually gets washed away, or the acetate, et cetera, gets washed away, and then you leave your alkaline buffer. So in that sense, for the paper, it's not quite as good, but it's way less invasive, right? Way easier to do. And I think there's a lot of work that should be done in this area to explore it. I think it shows a lot of potential. And I want to say shout out to Daniel Shaw. How you doing, my man? Huge X-Men fan. I should get Dan and Rick to talk about Marvel Superhero Secret Wars and the ridiculousness of Spider-Man somehow defeating the entire X-Men.
I loved that so much when I was a kid. I was riding home with that in my back pocket on my bike, ready to show off to all my Claremont loving friends. As a kid,
it's so ridiculous, Rick.
I've ever met the X-Men besides X-Men 35, which was actually a doppelganger of Spider-Man at first. I don't think last 20 years he'd met him and he wiped the floor with him.
Good grief. Come on. The professor could just turn his brain off and he would just drop limp to the floor.
Yeah, but he didn't. He was distracted, I guess. I remember specifically Wolverine came at him and he said, "Get those pig stickers away from me." And he smacked him across the room. And gave him back.
We have to admit Jim Shooter's best writing happened when he was 13 years old and killed off Pharaoh Lad. It wasn't Marvel Superhero Secret Wars.
Yes, it was. Sorry. Well, somebody did ask. It's a question I wanted to, because I get this a lot, and I have my own answer, but I wanted to let you guys have your answer here.
Non-conserved books in slabs, does that slow or speed up the self-destruct process? I would say that it slows on a couple of fronts. One, they don't universally do it, but for older books that need it, they put interleaving paper. That is, CGC puts interleaving paper in the book. Interleaving paper helps by absorbing acids and buffering the paper. And there's some studies that show actually like a buffer page, like an interleaving page, can actually deacidify a page 5 pages away in a book. So they have it's a fairly innocuous thing to do that has some pretty potentially significantly positive impact on the lifespan of the book. Also, you're controlling the amount of oxygen that gets in and out. So you're limiting the total oxygen, the oxygenation that can occur. So generally, I would say those two things are positive for the book. And if I had an option of buying, like the same book, either slabbed or in a polyethylene bag, or even a Mylar bag that I know that it's been in that, but didn't have interleaving paper, I would go with the slab.
Is that interleaving paper something that CGC for sure does? I mean, how do you know when they'll do it or when they won't?
So they used to have a policy where they put one behind the front cover, between the front cover and the first page, and then one behind the last page and the back cover. In Golden Age, they used to also add one in the centerfold. Sometime, I feel like it was about 2 years ago, they just said, we don't do it all the time now. We only do it when we think the book needs it.
Can you request it? Do you know?
You can request it. Whether or not it would be honored, I don't know. But there is a notes section where you can make requests like that. I suspect it would be honored unless they unless they goof on their end. I don't think they're not trying to do it because they're trying to save the pennies that they would save. I think when you look at the modern paper, there isn't really a need. It's not acidic like the old paper.
For the Golden and Silver Age.
Yeah. Oh, I think for Gold and Silver Age books, they're still putting it in almost universally. Okay. I mean, they may have some goofs where they don't just because they're humans, but I think it's their policy to still put it in the Gold and Silver Age books.
And I think they use zeolite paper too. Is that right? Still, I'm not sure if they still do that. They use zeolite paper that has the molecular traps for the protons and stuff. I don't know that they do it anymore, but at one point they did.
They are using, I don't know if it's that brand name, but they're using a paper like that. Yeah. A very effective interleaving paper.
I'll say there's 2 exceptions. I was almost going to agree with this. It slows everything down, but there's 2 exceptions. I would say that it doesn't. Okay, so one is that the slabbing seals something in the book that you would like to have come out of it. And I've seen this a couple times, but not a lot. One is because they're in Florida. If it's a very humid day, there's times when I've seen moisture pool at the bottom of the book and they drop it in there, and they're apologetic and they'll do it. Like it's someone's brought it to my attention.
Wow.
So I've seen this. Like there's enough humidity in the air that they seal the book and it gets colder somewhere else, that there's now moisture trapped inside here. Little drops. I'm not talking like a cup of water or anything, but you can see it fogging up. The other case is that if there's enough acid on the paper, it's already started to deteriorate, that exposing it to air would have done it some good first.
Wow. Yeah.
Like just run some air over it with like a fan, or you can actually smell it. It like burn your nose a little bit. It can be bad enough. The exception of those 2 conditions, I would agree that.
Yeah. Well, the choice given me was either raw book or the slab. I mean, the
conserved book or the slab.
Non-conserved, I thought.
Oh yeah, I think that's what they said. Okay, never mind then.
Yeah, the slab is not superior to a conservation, but if your choices are just bag and board versus slab, the slab is superior.
Sorry, I misread that it's conserved book.
Yeah, but also JC asked, can you get the interleaving paper? You can buy the interleaving paper, and You can buy it in different dimensions. That you could. It's actually very inexpensive. It's really thin, and but I don't even know what the cost per page is. But I mean, it's like pennies. It's pennies.
Trying to think. It used to be Kohl's, or not like the clothing store, but you know what I'm talking about, the anyway, people sell the Mylars. They used to sell it.
Oh, Bill Cole Enterprises.
Cole. Thank you.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay.
They used to sell it. I don't know if they still do anymore.
Looks like Rick is digging for some.
I'm trying to find some. I have a big pile of it somewhere. I'm trying to figure out where I bought it from.
Yeah.
Oh,
so in this slide,
I think I have a good. No, I was just going to say, if you're having trouble finding it, reach out to me. I have some on my Amazon influencer page. You can find it there as well.
So this slide, I just wanted, probably the two most popular things you'll see people talk about in terms of deacidification is calcium hydroxide or calcium carbonate. I mean, both will work. There are some benefits to using calcium hydroxide, such as just it being able to break down in water into a supersaturated solution a lot easier than calcium carbonate. I mean, both work the same, but we always suggest calcium hydroxide. I mean, it is a more, I don't want to say stronger, that's kind of a bad term, but when used properly, so in its saturated form, it's going to be around a 12 pH, and you dilute it to 1 to 4, and then you soak your paper wrap or cover in that. It's going to bring your pH up to about an 8.5. You don't want to soak it long. You don't want to use pure calcium hydroxide saturated solution, right? So you want to take those types of precautions.
Yeah. So the first two takeaways for me here are calcium hydroxide and calcium carbonate. They're in equilibrium anyway to a certain degree, because you have calcium, or you have CO2 in the air and it's reacting. You have CO2 in your water bath that's all over. The calcium hydroxide has a higher solubility, so it's easier to make, less likely to leave a residue on your paper. And it just is pretty much universally agreed since the 70s in the paper conservation community that it's the best thing to use. So it's really all we recommend. Couple comments here. Yes, JCP, you can make your own interleaving paper. I would not bother, because you can literally buy interleaving paper cheaper than you can buy printer paper, unless you're stealing it from the lab or something.
Right here, I bought it at a place called Ready Set Collect. Yeah. It was like $8.
That stuff's expensive though, Rick. So they sell interleaving paper on Amazon for like librarians. Mm-hmm. I'm talking pennies per page. Yeah, that stuff's like 10 times the cost of what you can buy.
I think the stuff Rick has, I think, is around 10 to 12 cents a page, if I remember right. Because I used to use that. But
that's good stuff. That's good stuff. But you can find it much more affordably. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we just had one more slide, and then I know that you got a time limit here.
I have 6 minutes remaining on my time limit here.
So just in terms of conservation, I mean, deacidification, proper storage. I mean, cool, dry environments, acid-free enclosures. We've kind of gone through the composition of paper. So, if you want to nerd out some more, hit us up over in the comic book conservation community. We love nerding out on chemistry stuff like this. I'm sure Rick would be happy to nerd out with you. And so that's all I got.
I love this quote, that today the biggest threat to classic comics isn't mishandling, it's the paper themselves. They're their own worst enemy.
At this point, yeah, because everybody's heard that old comic books are worth money, right? Like they're not being thrown away accidentally anymore. I mean, I don't know what kind of a rock you would have to have lived under for the last 40 years to not know that if you find old comics, they're worth something, right? Mm-hmm. So they're really not under a lot of threat anymore of people not knowing and insulating walls with them and that kind of stuff. They really are, you know, that this auto destruct feature is actually the biggest threat they face right now. And that's why we're such big proselytizers for conservation.
It goes the other direction, that people come up to you with comics they think are worth a ton and they're not worth anything.
Oh yeah.
But look how old they are.
I mean, there wouldn't be eBay if that weren't the case.
That's true.
Yeah. So Mark, have you got what you wanted out of this discussion?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure meeting both of you, and I can't wait for your book.
Awesome.
And I'm sure you're gonna have a ton of questions once I go through it.
Yeah, I think we should do this every once in a while. We should all have like a less prepared like Q&A session where we just sort of answer questions for the public with, you know, we get enough humble people with, you know, good enough working brains. We got two neurons to rub together. We can come up with an answer, you know. And I've learned stuff. I tell you what, I learn stuff from these guys every time I talk to them.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, and same goes for you. I mean, you know, but the trial and error experience stories are going to be the best ones. You know, the ones that we blew it, or we found a trick to. You know.
And that's something we're going to do on the next book. Is we're going to have a lot of the mistakes. We're going to talk about the things you shouldn't do and some of the mistakes, so people can learn from that. Because I think learning from the mistakes is just as important as learning what to do.
And
sometimes more fun.
A community of these people, like and everybody else, and you, Mark, and people who have like a positive view on this and a willingness to work together. And that I appreciate that we're not gatekeeping the information, and that we're sharing and cooperating and reading papers and doing it in a science-based way, which is very different than it was when I first started here. When I first started doing this channel by myself, I had to shut comments off a lot. There's a lot of angry people that say, you don't do it like that, you're an idiot, or you're cheating people. And it's like, this is such a better environment than when I started doing this. It was rough at first. I won't lie. It was people that were negative to each other. People were angry if you share the information. People were angry if you held it back. People who thought that you were tricking other people or had different viewpoints, and it was aggressive. And now this is, I just want to say, from that long-term exposure to it, that my heart is warm right now. It really is.
We really have gone. We spend a lot of time incubating an environment where people can express themselves, share what they're working on, not be judged, and where we're not gatekeeping. And we just decided early on that was how we wanted to operate, and we haven't tolerated any deviation from that. I mean, there's still drama happening. You know, we have this comic book conservation community on Facebook. It's our little playground. There's several cleaning and pressing Facebook groups. The amount of, and I'm members of all of them, right? And I've learned from the folks there, and I enjoy those those Facebook groups. But the amount of infighting that's happening and insulting and behavior that's just unbecoming gentle people is shocking to me. And I think about it and I go, they're literally angry because they think some other person squishes funny books the wrong way. Yeah. That's what they're angry about. There couldn't possibly be something less trivial to be upset about. It's so ridiculous in my mind. So we just don't participate in it.
I remember one time I went to SmackDown in the 90s with The Rock and those guys. And, you know, it's obviously very staged. They had a car in the parking lot from them to go out and beat up the other guy's car because he lost or something, right? It's so clearly staged. But there were people getting drunk in the crowd fighting about the two guys. So there was a real fight about people's fake
the fake fight. Yeah, yeah. That's how ludicrous humans can be if you let them go, man.
I was just enjoying. I almost want to face the other way and watch the crowd because they were far more entertaining.
Are we getting cut in 20 seconds here?
Actually, they notified me that they're giving me 3 more minutes free.
Oh, okay.
To wrap up for me, I appreciate the inclusion in this, and it's been very.
Mark, it's been great to meet you, man. You're a cool dude, and you said you're in Denver. Or Colorado, you said.
I'm in Centennial, yeah, Denver Metro, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, so he overpays for comic books whenever he goes to Mile High.
I go to my buddy's new shop, the Collectible Marketplace, and he's awesome. Sang's a great guy.
Yeah.
Let us know. Share your results with us. I'm interested to see what happens with those.
For sure.
Especially those foil covers. I want to see what comes of those.
This stack this week, and I'll get you guys feedback for sure.
Yeah, we could do a before and after session sometime. That'd be a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Everybody, good night. Take care. And Shelby, can you sign us out, please?
All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And with that, we're going to say peace, love, and comics. Bye, all.
See you, everybody.
Take care of one another.